Well, thank you so much, Children with Cancer UK. It's a delight to be here. And, I have no disclosures, no financial conflicts of interest, and thank my funders and my colleagues. So I'd like to put our outreach and translation from the Center for Integrative Research on Childhood Leukemia and the environment into the context of the movement of children's environmental health in the United States, at least. And so some background, as has been noted by some already, that children, in fact, are different, and the fetus as well, in many ways. Children may have different exposures. They have different breathing rates. If you look at the chart on breathing rate, you see that really from birth to old age, breathing rates decrease. The same is true for water consumption and food consumption. So contaminants that we're exposed to, children often are exposed to a relatively larger amount per body weight. And on top of that, they behave differently, so that they're often exposed differently than adults. For example, a child that's on the floor is exposed to different levels of contaminants than somebody who's up and walking around. For example, mercury vapor is heavier than air, so it concentrates down there. And also, they're unable to remove themselves before they're ambulatory from something that's noxious, and so they may have increased exposure for that reason as well. You might add that to the fetus, so they don't have much control over their environment. Pediatric environmental health is an area of interest. I would go back to Robert Miller, who was with the NCI, but during the occupation of Japan after World War II, he was a pediatrician in the Army stationed there and involved in radiation issues. He came back to the United States, and as a member of the Academy of Pediatrics, American Academy of Pediatrics, founded the Committee on Radiation, which over years developed into the Committee on Environmental Health. When I was on that committee in the 1990s, under the chairmanship of Ruth Etzel, we developed the Handbook on Pediatric Environmental Health, which is about to go into its 4th edition now. And it has, 35, 40 chapters on different pediatric environmental health issues, and is an excellent resource. The Pediatric Environmental Health Network, Pediatric Environmental Health Specialty Unit Network, these are clinically based programs at substantial institutions around the United States. There are 10 of them, are funded by the United States EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, and the CDC. And we provide both education and support for clinicians that are encountering issues around environmental health. There's a similar kind of network of children's environmental health research centers, of which Circle, that Catherine and I are part of at the UC Berkeley. There's about a dozen of those which are funded by US EPA and the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences. In our case, we work together quite closely, and particularly on the outreach and translation portion. The other thing many things we've learned from the history of pediatric environmental health, and one is these concept of critical windows of development, which are also talked about as windows of vulnerability, but they can also be windows of opportunity. As noted in the case of leukemia, there's a first hit event that appears to be quite relevant in utero. And then, as evidenced by the 1221 translocation types of childhood leukemia, that there's perhaps 100 times those number in newborns that have that translocation then go on to have childhood leukemia, there's a requirement for an additional hit or more, but also it's partially obscured on the slide, but there's potential mitigating factors in between: breastfeeding, routine daycare, in early infection, and diet with folate and other things. So that, I think that there's a positive and negative side of everything. Another thing that I think we've learned is that as with other chemical exposures, there's the potential for increased potency for exposure to carcinogens in utero or early in life. And there are not that many well-documented examples in epidemiology, but this is one from a colleague of mine, Craig Steinmaus, that looked at Chile, where there was quite a unique natural experiment with arsenic, and they're able to show that exposure early in life to arsenic was related to perhaps a 2 to 4-fold greater risk of developing lung and bladder cancer, of course, as adults. Another thing that the history tells us is that it takes a long time from when a chemical or an issue starts to be recognized to the time period that we really, get to the what are low dose effects. So this is looking at that history for mercury, and from the early days of Minamata and other exposures to the early 2000s, you see an almost 30-fold reduction in what we considered to be hazardous health and endpoint exposure. And I add this because we don't have the level of experimentation and studies in the cancer field that we do for mercury in regards to childhood leukemia, but this is benzene, and what this group did was fit 6 human adult studies to natural spline, and the three other than the lower right figure. And the lower right is a traditional linear dose response curve. But the natural spline curves show a supralinear dose response, which is similar to what we've learned about lead poisoning, so that in fact the dose response in the lower levels of lead poisoning contributes much more to the impact in the population of the impact on neurodevelopmental aspects of children. So we may be talking about something that's much more significant in the general population, and I think that was shown in a slide yesterday by Dr. Vincentetti from Italy. We know from a long time ago, in the 1990s, there was a survey done. This is just a few of the endpoints that were discussed. A survey of parents and of pediatricians in the United States. And what they asked is, how much did you worry about this on a scale for parents, and how often did you give advice about this information of pediatricians? And things like ear infections, lots and lots of advice given by pediatricians with a relatively low worry standard by parents. And of the 38 things that they asked about, the things that parents worried about at the highest level were in fact environmental toxins, toxicants, and the pediatricians had the lowest level of discussing those exposures. So with that background, I thought, well, let's look at what pediatric oncology providers in the U.S. are doing. And we had both our group network within California to ask questions and a network around the Huntsman Cancer Institute and Dana-Farber in Boston. And we had almost 200 respondents. One of the questions we ask is, do you think that environmental exposures are important contributors to childhood cancer? Well, in all groups, more than half did, but particularly nurse practitioners. And then we asked, well, in taking a history, do you ask about any of these different things that have been associated in one way or another with potential risk? And the only one that was over 50% was parents' occupation, and I guess my thought is that's probably related to billing questions, but most of them, in fact, didn't ask much, and I think a quarter asked absolutely none of these questions. So if you don't ask about it, you're not going to find. Well, one of the things is that in fact, medical students in the United States haven't been trained in taking an environmental history, so that I think the ones that are mainly are taking an allergy history, not what we would be thinking about in this case. So, from these people, over 90%, so almost all of them report getting questions from parents about environmental exposures and the potential relationship with their children's illness. At least half said they were quite uncomfortable in giving any kind of advice or discussing these issues. And hopefully, though, 92% said they thought it would be helpful to know more about these things. We also looked at the American Society of Pediatric Hematology and Oncology annual meeting abstracts for 2 years. So that was over 550 abstracts, and looked for things that dealt with causation, which were maybe about 8% of the abstracts. But when we looked for something that was an environmental risk, not a genetic risk, only about 1%. So 6, maybe 5 or 6 of those abstracts over 2 years. When we looked at the overall literature covering that, we found about 57 papers in the literature. Now, where were they published? Environmental Health Perspectives, Journal Epidemiology, et cetera. These are not the journals that the clinical practitioners and clinical oncologists are in fact reading. So that's one take-home I would say is, please publish, if you are doing any kind of environmentally related publications, please publish in the journals that the clinicians read, or at least to do that for review papers. So clearly education was needed, and so we had this ongoing project, The Story of Health, which is an e-book, and we decided to do a chapter on childhood leukemia. There was one on asthma, learning disabilities, and other things. We decided to do one on childhood leukemia. The overall idea for the Story of Health is that we're interested in the broad ecology of health. So from the molecular signaling events that are relevant in a personal level of exposure and health, but also that the individual nested within their important relationships, family, society, and even the entire ecosystem, as well as the relative impacts and potential cumulative impacts over a lifetime or perhaps even intergenerationally. And it takes the form of a visually, I think, quite interesting format, and it's very interactive, and it follows individuals from this family reunion. Family reunion allows it to be people of different ages, different parts of the country, different economic status, different races. So we talk that in, and the child's standing next to the dog in the middle is Stephen. He's a 3-year-old who comes down with childhood leukemia. It follows him from through diagnosis and treatment and brings up a great number of issues. We have some very wonderful paintings that were done by Susan McFarlane, who was British, now passed away, who was given a grant to produce art around these paintings around the treatment of childhood leukemia. So we're able to bring up all kinds of issues, and we start with some basic biology and incidence and that sort of thing. Why the early life is important in general. It has embedded videos, embedded links to other things like the National Cancer Institute and others. We're able to bring in issues like pesticides. It turns out that the parents of Stephen have a nursery, a plant nursery, and they are using pesticides regularly, so that question can come up. We can bring up the epidemiology, and when we do, this is for a general clinical audience or perhaps people that don't already understand what a meta-analysis is and how do you look at that. So we have a pop-up that describes that and things like that. So I encourage you, the story of health is being incorporated into the University of California, San Francisco Medical School curriculum that's being rewritten, and so in a variety of ways that's being used along with other material to try to embed within the entire curriculum mention of environmental causes of health and disease. So, when I got involved in the COTC for CIRCLE, so that's the Community Outreach Translation Core for our center, which I think is another thing I should mention. For all of the Children's Environmental Health research centers that NIEHS and EPA fund, there's a requirement to have one of these outreach translation programs. So I think that's been quite valuable. When I got involved in this, I said, well, what's our baseline here? Where are we going to be at? And besides the survey I showed you, I thought, well, okay, what does the American Cancer Society say? So they said a number of years ago, and I just looked it up the other night to make sure that this hasn't changed, but they say most adults and children with leukemia have no known risk factors, and they put there way to prevent leukemias from developing. Well, that certainly is a true statement, but it leads people to think that there is no research that indicates there's a potential issue. And I liken it to sudden infant death syndrome, where in the early 1990s, a group of pediatricians came to the American Academy of Pediatrics, and based on work in New Zealand and Australia and some other places, they said we should have a program that encourages people to have their babies sleep on their backs. And so there was a lot of discussion about it. There was much more limited information than we have about a number of risk factors for childhood leukemia. And there were people that said, well, no, we shouldn't do that. We don't even understand the mechanism by which children that have SIDS die. We don't understand what causes this. If we don't know the mechanism, how can we feel confident in using this epidemiology? But the Back to Sleep campaigners won the day, and over a number of years cut the incidence of SIDS with their campaigns to about 50% of what it was previously. So here we are 25 years later or more, and we still don't know the mechanisms that are involved. So if we were waiting for the mechanisms, we wouldn't have done anything, and many, many children's lives would have been lost. So I'm just going to go strictly to the bottom of this. So the back, when they discussed how the recommendations were arrived at, they said, of course, you need consistent findings, but beyond that, they said, it's possible to give these kind of recommendations that when there is a high certainty that there would be a net benefit from what you would be doing, and it's that the conclusion was unlikely to be strongly affected by the results of future studies. So that doesn't mean that you have a requirement for a large number of prospective cohort studies. That's really not necessary. And of course, for childhood leukemia, to get to the place where we're at with the case control studies about knowledge for cohort studies is certainly far in the future. So what's the level of understanding? Where are we at relevant to that? Well, I'm just taking this as one example from the CLIC program, where there was a pooled analysis of several studies looking at maternal occupational exposure to pesticides and AML, and you have over a 2.5-fold increased risk. But then, as a state of the art, they took all other studies that were available that they could, which is an additional 4 studies. The risk actually for those was higher, and so they come out to an over 3-fold risk. Well, when you have 8 well-controlled studies, all consistently, at least with point estimates, showing increased risk, and these are done over a period of years and in many different countries, the likelihood that an additional study or 2 or 3 is going to change that conclusion is highly unlikely. So another factor that I think is important is, well, we need to look at what's the potential impact. So what percentage of childhood leukemia might actually be attributable in some way to these exposures? So we took what we thought were 4 of the best documented areas for which we could get some kind of population exposure information as well. And we looked at them in a variety of ways, and one was using our California data. We did that because we had all of the data so that we could actually look at what the combined risk was there easily, and not just using some statistical formula. And the information from multinational collaborative, the CLIC, and then we have population surveys for exposure. And what we see relative risks from these for different risk factors. So one is paint and solvent exposure, tobacco use by the father, either pre-conception or in pregnancy, residential use of insecticides, and traffic-related air pollution. And these range from around a 20% increased risk to over 50% in these studies. And just to quickly run through a few of the background here, here's a meta-analysis on air pollution. Has been mentioned from the CDC, with a number of studies, all with point estimates that were greater than 1. Catherine's shown this, for home use of paints and childhood ALL from the CLIC consortium, paternal smoking and childhood ALL, a number of studies looking at different time periods of exposure, but showing dose response impact, home use of pesticides, again from the CLIC studies with some of these are as many as 5,000 cases. So I would call these substantial levels of evidence, and that they actually are or could be considered systematic reviews. Really, the CLIC examinations really are systematic reviews. And then what's the probability of exposure for these? And we have substantial exposures. So 20, 30, up to 50% of the population exposed to some of these things they're quite common. So when you have even a relatively small increase in risk, but a large population that's exposed, then you could be talking about substantial percentage of impact. And that indeed is what we find, individually, between 5 and 10%, maybe if you look at the mean, central tendencies for these things, and looked at, by different ways. This is all draft, so it's subject to some change, but we've been looking at it and toying with different ways of trying to improve it. And I think the information from Italy that was presented yesterday will be helpful for us. So when we do this, we look at it, we for these 4 factors, it appears that somewhere perhaps in the 20 to 30% of ALL are attributable to those 4 factors, at least in part. So that's quite substantial. Now, in the abstract, I included this table. So here's another part of what's the net benefit? For a big population, thing that you would do, you need to show that you're going to have some net benefit. Well, here I would just say there are co-benefits. It's hard to have an economically viable net benefit for a big population program, except for all of these, there are many other things that they have as far as health impacts. So air pollution, we know, we'll just do this one as an example. Preterm birth, asthma, respiratory development, cardiovascular disease, neurodevelopmental disorders, So, and there are already public health activities going on. This is true for all of these, for folic acid supplementation, et cetera. So it shouldn't be controversial. We're just talking about adding to the discussion the potential that it might reduce your risk for childhood leukemia. Well, so for folate, I'm going to go on and talk about what are we doing in the United States, but for folate, we have about a quarter of women of childbearing age that have suboptimal folate levels, despite the public health programs. In the UK, they're relatively similar, a little bit less, perhaps, but you can see that it's the younger age group with the highest risk, and then certain populations, Scotland and Northern Ireland, where they have a higher risk for suboptimal folate. I'm just saying this to say, you could look at your own data for where you might go with trying to do something with this kind of information. Consequential epidemiology says that you want to identify causes and distributions insofar as they might help you to prevent or control disease, but this paper by Sandro Galea puts out several other things about what is consequential epidemiology, and he includes that it embraces translation and implementation science. If John Snow had only discovered there was a relationship between the water and cholera but not taken the pump handle off, we probably wouldn't remember his name today. So you need to do something with the information. So what are some key things that we've learned? Well, we've learned, it's been discussed, that there's a higher risk for Latino children. We've known that for a while, but in California at least, that risk is rapidly outpacing the rise. The rise in that risk is outpacing the rise in the white population. That there's risk even before conception, that adequate folate's important, and in fact that's possibly needed before conception, or it's certainly early post-conception, and that some key exposures are tobacco, solvents, pesticides, traffic. So what we've done is started this program improving environmental health literacy of young adults, because we found that, well, how are you going to get to people pre-conception? You got to get to early, younger people. We developed this, it's a 10-minute shadow puppet theater video in English and Spanish. And one of the things we do with it is work with promotoras de salud, which are community health workers. And so we do a training in environmental health and include discussion of childhood leukemia, but of all these other kinds of things. And then this is one product that they can use in their training and working with their community members. And another is a comic book which we developed. Rosa and Carlos get married, and it follows through this story of marriage, and that allows us to talk about, preconception, for example, and child leukemia is mentioned. Here's another product that's from our pediatric environmental health specialty unit, and this is an app at peht.ucsf.edu, and it's a web app, so you need a web connection to utilize it. It's not downloadable, but if you click on it's Pediatric Environmental Health Toolkit, and if you click on the home page under Environmental Health Hazards, I'll just give you one example, you get a list of these different areas. There's 12, either individual chemicals or exposure scenarios, and you click on pesticides. You have a very short review of the topic. You have a short review of health effects that are known. You have what are the exposure sources, and then most importantly, what are some prevention strategies, ones that you might, what about diet, what about in the home, school, daycare, and then there's a separate one with agricultural exposures. And then there are links embedded within this. Now I have a video that I'd like to play for you that we did in collaboration with Dr. Bruce Lanphier, who's an epidemiologist and has done a series of these.
For the past 50 years, we've clung to the belief that with enough investment, we'll find cures for what kills us. We've invested billions of dollars in technology and a never-ending search for elusive cures, waging war on cancer, synthesizing new drugs, and hunting for genetic links with disease and aging. Why do we invest so much in genetic research? Why is it so alluring? Only a few diseases are exclusively genetic, like cystic fibrosis, and a few are exclusively environmental, like being hit by a car. Most chronic diseases or disorders, like cancer, heart disease, and autism, result from the interaction of environmental triggers, like air pollution, and our genetic makeup. Focusing on genetics makes sense if we want to continue to chase elusive cures. But here's the thing. If we identify environmental triggers or causes and eliminate them, we can prevent children from developing leukemia, autism, and other diseases. Investing in cures, which worked well for infections, gave us a sense of comfort in the face of death and disability of unknown cause. We can't live in a state of perpetual doubt, Daniel Kahneman said, so we make up the best story possible and we live as if the story were true. But this belief that genetic research and technology will solve our health problems is flawed. It fails to acknowledge that the worldwide epidemic of chronic disease is largely due to technologies of the past: tobacco, motor vehicles, air pollution, heavily processed foods, and toxic chemicals. But wait, aren't promising cures for chronic disease just around the corner? There are some effective drugs like antibiotics and insulin, but few real cures. Childhood leukemia, a dreaded disease of the 21st century, is a success story. Today, over 80% of children are cured of leukemia, once considered a uniformly fatal disease. Still, children with leukemia undergo wrenching treatments that disrupt their lives over many years. Some develop new cancers from chemotherapy or radiation. Many live in constant fear of relapse. What's more, cases of leukemia have risen by over 35% during the past 40 years, so many more children and their families will experience this wrenching disease. Let's take a closer look at why some children develop leukemia. This cluster of 100 children represents all children with leukemia. We've learned that paints and solvents, traffic, pesticides, and tobacco smoke can increase a child's risk of developing leukemia. If we eliminated these environmental triggers, we could prevent about 25% of cases. Yet too often, cancer agencies and foundations remain fixated on treatment, even as avoidable causes are discovered. In fact, only 1% of research dollars for childhood cancer is spent on prevention. Why aren't we doing more to prevent leukemia? Let's look at another condition, autism. Autism has risen dramatically over the past 4 decades. Our genes don't change that quickly, so the rapid rise in autism is primarily due to environmental triggers. Yet we spent 96% of research dollars to identify genes linked to autism. Only 4% was spent to identify environmental triggers. Medicine is great at mending people if they have health insurance, but the real victories, like the elimination of polio, the reduction in motor vehicle deaths, and the decline in lung cancer, largely resulted from community-wide prevention programs. People get it. Over 70% of Americans favor spending more on prevention, yet 95% of our overall health dollars are spent on medical care and expensive drugs. What can we do about it? We need parents, physicians, and advocates to use their voices to support prevention. We need stronger laws and policies to protect people from pollutants. We need to test chemicals for toxicity before they are used in consumer products. We need to invest more in research to prevent disease. It won't be easy, but it's time to revise our story. Our lives depend on it.
Not to take away at all about the tremendous work, research on treatment, which is of course so important, but shouldn't a little bit more go toward this other kinds of basically public health. So I have, if you switch now to my, this little Rosa and Carlos plan a family, just to give an idea about another thing we do with working with families. So this is a microsite, so it's something made to look at on a phone, and it basically takes this story from the comic book and puts it into an even more simplified format. So you know, it says, you know, incidence in Latinos, which is one of our populations we're trying to do, getting high and rising. And then we incorporate, you know, you scroll down, here's a graphic that puts that into some perspective, at least in California, for the increase, relative increase. And then before pregnancy, that message, you know, this is an issue before pregnancy, and then when should you start protecting your child? I think the bottom line to these infographics we're using is start protecting your child's health before they are conceived. And this fits with the ACOG and the Royal College of Obstetrics here, who are trying to encourage preconception counseling. You know, similarly, food, and, you know, what do we know about that? And the similar, you know, kind of, well, we need a healthy nutrition. And again, similar things throughout. Fathers are important. You know, they're part of the program, so tobacco and that. So this sort of thing. So we have a number of different products on our website. And with that, and just mention here of this volume that the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences helped come up with. It's environmental health literacy, and I was a contributor in part to a chapter on health professionals' environmental health literacy. It's currently available as an ebook. Print edition is due to come out soon. With that, thank you so much for allowing me to be here today.
Many thanks, Mark. That was very, very interesting. Any questions, any burning questions before we move on? Yeah. Can I just ask one thing? On the packaging of pesticides in California, does it specifically mention the risk of childhood cancer and exposure while pregnant? So when you buy a pesticide, does it say, if you use this when you're pregnant, you increase the risk of your child getting cancer?
So the program that would be done under is called Prop 65, a labeling requirement, and it would depend on the individual pesticide, whether or not they've reviewed it and determined that there's a carcinogenic risk. So there are some. It's not an overall. No. Yeah.
But there are plenty that you would advise against, and you have really good literature and lots of information, and I very much back that. But I think there's a disjunction here, isn't there, between what's on the product and the information that you might be able to see if
Right.
you're able to access the internet and
Right.
perhaps of a certain educational background, etc.,
Yeah,
etc.
and of course, nationally, there's no labeling like that. And so this is a unique program in California, Prop 65.
Yeah. David.
Mark has a fantastic presentation. I love your video. I want to play it at the Department of Health next Tuesday when I'm meeting them to discuss access to public health data. So if you send me the link, that would be good.
Yes.
That's one thing. The second thing, we had a discussion earlier on. We need to change the chapters in people's textbooks and stop writing as the first line in every chapter on childhood cancer saying childhood cancer is rare. That is an incorrect statement. Childhood cancer is an unavoidable complication of growth and development that occurs in different organs at different ages, repeatedly in every society across the world. And we need to say, and your programs have identified, that cancer is an ever-present risk in childhood, and we have to be thinking about it constantly. So the concept of rareness, adult cancers don't occur in childhood cancers don't occur in adulthood. Cancer is an ever-present, it's as common as epilepsy, diabetes mellitus, and bacterial meningitis if you don't have an immunization program. And so we need to say these things quite clearly in our training of new doctors.
Yeah, let me just say that, thank you for those comments. That video is available both at a link from our website, Circle website, and also at littlethingsmatter.ca. No dots between, or spaces between Little Things Matter. Just littlethingsmatter.ca.
Okay, we should move on. Many thanks, Mark.